hotels, shops and cafes, factories and schools. And here are French people, modern Europeans, following a modern pattern of living. This pattern of living has been developing for hundreds of years. It has grown out of earlier ways of doing things, earlier patterns that have influenced our modern world. One of the most important of these earlier patterns of life was feudalism, which developed in the Middle Ages. In rural France today, we can find castles such as this. In the Middle Ages, the castle was the home of the ruling nobleman. It represented the military security that was part of the feudal system. The church represented the religious basis, and the land, the source of wealth, represented the economic system that made feudalism possible. In feudal times, the land called France had no strong central government. The country was divided into many domains, each controlled by a powerful nobleman. By the end of the 13th century, feudalism had disappeared in most of Europe. But even today, we can find many towns in rural France where we can get an idea of the meaning of feudalism. Here, some of the houses and streets date back to feudal times. Here, people have been living for almost 800 years in the shadow of the great castle. We can find out more about the castle by seeing it with Jacques, a boy of this town. Jacques, and learn with him a little more about the feudal system that was once so widespread in his country. We already know that one of the important elements of the feudal system was the castle. The castle that Jacques knows so well is a typical example. Like many feudal castles, it was placed high on a hill so that it could be defended by the feudal nobleman against neighboring lords with whom he was often at war. For the feudal lord who lived here, the thick walls and narrow windows made the castle not only a home, but a fortress as well. Jacques has made a sketch of the way most feudal castles were built. Although no two castles were alike, most of them had a main gate, a courtyard, and a tower stronghold called the dungeon. There was usually a drawbridge over the moat, a surrounding ditch filled with water. Jacques looks down into the moat that surrounds the castle. We can imagine how difficult it would be for any attacking force to cross a deep moat filled with water. The only way to cross the moat was by way of the drawbridge, which could be pulled up by means of chains. Behind the deep moat and thick walls, the loyal defenders of the castle could keep watch over the countryside. And so the castles were strongholds, fortresses that were the only places of safety in the days of feudal warfare. What else can we learn about the castle? Within the outer walls was the courtyard, an enclosed area. Let's follow Jacques as he goes through the main gate into the courtyard. Here is a space that was large enough to contain the noblemen's soldiers as well as the common people who might come here for protection. In the courtyard is the well that furnished water. Every castle had its own supplies of food and water so that its people could be self-sufficient in time of siege. During war, the main stronghold of defense was the big tower called the keep, or dungeon. Even after 800 years, the massive walls of this dungeon give us a good idea of the protection they afforded to the feudal lord and his followers. Inside the castle, we can see how the feudal lords and ladies lived. The rooms were usually large and drafty. A wood fire in the fireplace supplied the heat. Wooden hung the few pieces of furniture in the room. For decoration, the stone walls were often hung with hand-woven cloths called. Into these colorful textiles, the people of the Middle Ages wove scenes of their everyday life. We can see how the people looked and what kind of clothes they wore. We can see something of their activities, the great feast which the feudal lord gave for his followers, the hunts and pageants to which both men and women rode on horseback. In this courtly life of the feudal nobility, there developed a code of courage, of gentle manners and respect for women, a code of chivalry which has given us many of our customs of courtesy and sportsmanship. Chivalry was the code of honor which the feudal lord was expected to uphold. When the lord went out to battle, he fought according to this code of chivalry. Feudal days were the days of knights in armor. Fighting was almost continuous in the struggles between the feudal nobles for land and power. Much of the power of each feudal lord depended on the feudal system of loyalty, the loyalty of his followers, who were called vassals. This vassal, swearing allegiance to his lord, is performing the act of fealty that bound the feudal society together. What else helped to regulate the feudal society? Part of the system was the religious element. Often the chapel or church was built within the castle. We can still see in France many of the churches built in feudal times. On some of them, we can see decorative carvings that represent men and women who lived in feudal times when the church was built. On this church is the figure of a feudal knight with his sword and shield. His code of chivalry was closely related to the church. Part of the ceremony for attaining knighthood required praying and fasting in the church. The young knight was expected to be loyal, not prince, but also to the ideals of his religion. Religion set standards of conduct and regulated the life of feudal men and women from birth to death. The members of the clergy took an active part in the economic system of feudalism. Churchmen built many buildings and controlled great tracts of land, just as the feudal lords did. The land was a source of wealth, and many abbots and bishops were powerful feudal lords with their own vassals and landholdings. Land was an important part of the feudal system, as were the church and the castle. The land surrounding the castle belonged to the feudal lord and was called the manor. The feudal manor was usually organized into 3 main fields. From the castle, Jacques looks out over the land below and sees the cultivated fields that long ago were part of the feudal manor. Jacques remembers that in feudal times, the 3 main fields were divided into long strips that were farmed by the individual peasants. In the days of feudalism, the peasants, called serfs, could not leave the land on which, and most of what they produced belonged to the lord who owned. The serfs did much of the work by hand with the aid of simple tools. In return for their labor, the serfs received the protection of the lord of the manor. Today, French farmers own and work their own fields in the shadow of the feudal castle. Today, as in the past, the land is an important source of wealth, and even certain methods of farming, such as allowing some fields to lie fallow or uncultivated, are customs dating back to feudal times. And so the land is still important in the scheme of living, just as it was in the age of feudalism. With Jacques, we have seen how the castle, the church, and the land fitted into the pattern of feudalism. This feudal way of life was gradually replaced by another pattern, which began with the rise of towns. As trade developed in the Middle Ages, a new class replaced the classes of noblemen and serfs, and the town began to replace the castle as the center of social life. And so the feudal system passed away, first in one place and then another. But the that system, the aristocratic society and its code of chivalry, the religious system and its power, the land and its organization and use, these have influenced modern life. These are part of the meaning of feudalism.